During the winter of my sophomore year in high school, a fist fight broke out in the cafeteria. It wasn't anybody I knew especially well, and it didn't get very far, but it marked a day in my life I'll never forget. Once the commotion started and the chant of fight, fight, fight rose up in the lunchroom, everybody stood to cheer and watch. I did too, craning my neck with the crowd, probably wearing a sophomoric smirk on my face. It felt to me like the whole world had gotten to its feet. Everybody except one person. I only noticed when it was over, and all of us turned to sit back down. My friend JJ hadn't budged. Judging by the fact that his sandwich was gone, he hadn't even let the matter affect his lunch. He didn't ask any questions about the fight. He just bit into his apple. The rest of us tittered on about the whole thing, who we were rooting for, whether it would continue at the park after school, blah, blah, blah. JJ just stared off into space. Finally, the contrast felt too much for me, and I said, "Hey man, why didn't you stand up?" "I don't like fights," he responded. Then he looked at me and said, "You don't like fights either." He was right. JJ and I had been friends for a long time and had talked often about our dim view of high school fights. Small as it might seem, I couldn't get the matter out of my head. Why had JJ stayed seated while I stood up? It's a question that leads me to a great scene in the film Almost Famous. The scene where the legendary rock journalist Lester Bangs offers advice to a young writer just starting out. Bangs is mad about the direction rock and roll is going, and he blames rock journalists. They go to parties, they hang out with pretty girls, they become friends with the musicians. Soon enough, they're penning sanctimonious stories about the genius of rock stars. In Bang's mind, this not only corrupts the moral core of the writers, it threatens to ruin the music. He describes the descent with a sense of disgust. Rock and roll will no longer be real. It will no longer be authentic. It will become just another industry of cool. For me, that scene from Almost Famous captures perfectly the purpose of a liberal arts education: to nurture the virtues of uncoolness. I imagine you are looking at me thinking, I bet that guy has a lot of practice being uncool. So true. But for many years, I tried the opposite, and I cared a lot about it. I look upon that now as wasted effort, all of that time following the siren song of someone else's idea of cool rather than defining my own moral core, all of that energy pretending to care about things that didn't really matter to me rather than cultivating my own sense of calling. Thank God for universities like Elon who take the liberal arts seriously, because the liberal arts are the magic kingdom of the uncool. I think there are three great virtues in a liberal arts education. Call it the trinity of uncoolness. The first is to make you decide for yourself what matters. Being cool means figuring out what scores points right now with the people right around you. Being cool forces you, as T.S. Eliot said, to prepare a face to meet the faces that you meet. The liberal arts values the opposite. The liberal arts encourages expansive self-reflection on eternal questions, aided by thinkers who have been relevant across continents and centuries. The liberal arts requires you to author your own moral core. And once you come to articulacy about what matters to you, a liberal arts education equips you with the skills to build a life around it, gives you the tools to carve a path and the courage to walk it. That's the second virtue. Listen, if you are able to do those two things, identify what matters to you and build a life around it, you have earned the silver star of uncoolness. But for those who seek gold, the liberal arts offers a third virtue: the skills to spread your gospel, to convince others that what matters to you ought to matter to them. Almost Famous is a film about applying these three virtues. The aging veteran Lester Bangs has built a life around his vision of rock and roll. He goes to shows and listens to albums. He gives voice to the kind of music that he thinks matters. he takes to the earnest young apprentice William Miller because it's an opportunity to pass this tradition along, to teach his values. Bangs gives young Miller some advice. Keep your distance from the band and the parties and the pretty girls. Be honest and unmerciful about the music. Stay uncool. William Miller jots those words down in his little writer's pad, vows to live by them. But sure enough, he goes soft. He violates the code. The rock stars, the parties, he gets caught up in the whole scene. Feeling guilty, he calls his mentor and confesses. At the end of his conversation, Miller thanks him for being home to take the call. I'm always home, says Lester Bangs. I'm uncool. And then he drops this gem. The only true currency in this bankrupt world is what you share with someone else when you're uncool. I went to my 20-year high school reunion last summer. JJ didn't show up, but I thought a lot about the day of that fight as I shook hands and gave half hugs. There was a lot of talk about prom queens and who was hot then. It all made me think of the Dylan song, You Gotta Serve Somebody. I guess I couldn't believe that I'd spent so many years agonizing to serve this scene. The reunion was coming to an end, and there were whispers about an after party. It seems like everyone was going. Somebody asked if I was heading there too. Now you gotta understand, I spent my high school years praying to be invited to after parties with prom queens. But this time, things were different. Nah, man, I said, I'm good. I was staying with my mom that night. We hadn't seen each other for a while. I was going to try to make it back before she turned in so we'd have a chance to catch up. Driving home, I couldn't help but think that JJ'd be proud. After all these years, I'd achieved a small measure of uncoolness. I want to repeat the line read earlier by William Stafford. Sometime when the river is ice, ask me mistakes I have made. Ask me whether what I have done is my life. Standing up for that fight in high school, that was a mistake I made. That was not my life. It's a small thing, I know, but a good life is basically an accumulation of small things. Let me leave you with a story about St. Francis of Assisi. One morning when St. Francis was tending his garden, a man came by and asked, if you learned the world was going to end at 6 p.m. tonight, what would you do? And St. Francis said, I'd tend my garden. Students of Elon, on the occasion of your graduation, I wish you the fruits of your liberal arts education, your own garden and the tools to tend it, the strength to be honest and unmerciful about what matters most to you, and a community who shares with you the true currency of uncoolness. Thank you.